Take some water real quick. And go. What's up, YouTube? This is Juju here, and welcome to the channel. Today, I'm going to do something a little different. We're going to talk about how to beat board wipe death. The reason why I'm coming up with this guide was because I've seen like a couple of conversations on Reddit lately where I'm running into players where they're frustrated that they're running into these decks. This deck in particular, because it's so overpowered, it basically is the most expensive deck you can afford, with Demogorgons, Apocalypse Nows, Jasons, and you know, I keep running into players that are frustrated because they don't know how to deal with the deck. They run out of answers, or the deck just beats them outright. And while I do understand that the deck is very powerful, and not gonna lie, it's super powerful, I do want to help players out with helping them with strategies, or arming them with strategies, and informing them with ways to beat the deck. And maybe they won't win like 100% of the time, but at least with this knowledge, they can try to maybe up their win percentage by a couple of percentage points, right? And that's why I want to do this guide. A couple of disclaimers. So about me, I am a hardcore TCG player. I've been playing TCGs pretty much since like elementary school. Been playing competitively, Yu-Gi-Oh, Magic, Pokemon, and then eventually into Hearthstone. I was a regular legend player in Hearthstone, and I've beaten the world champion Pavel 2016 in an Open Cup tournament. That's like my claim to fame when it comes to Hearthstone. I've also done like a couple other things too, which is pretty nice. And now I'm moving on to God Unchained. I really like the game. I think owning digital cards is the next step for digital card games in particular. I spent a whole bunch of money into Hearthstone, and it made me sad when I stopped playing. I never got that money back, and Gods of Chain is kind of like the level up to it. But anyways, I did play Board Wipe Death for a little bit. I picked it up this weekend in Mythic rank, and I scored maybe 17 wins out of 25, which is respectable. It's not what I'd like. I can usually get like 20, 23, but I picked up the deck like maybe a week ago. So, but using this knowledge, I definitely decided to like help other players out. This guide is going to be based more towards like beginning and intermediate players rather than advanced players. But if you're an advanced player and you watch this guide, please feel free to put your experiences and your advice in the comments so that we can all help out like newer players with dealing with how to deal with board wipe death. So with that being said, I'm just going to go ahead and start. Cool. So the deck objectives for Board Wipe Death. Board Wipe Death is a control deck, typically wins in late game, and it has 2 win conditions depending on the matchup they're playing. Against aggro, it's pretty simple. You want to exhaust your opponent's resources by effectively eliminating their threats with your sleep cards and removal. Against control decks, you want to exhaust your opponent's resources by burning their cards through like overdraw situations, and by reaching favorable fatigue situations via cards like Jason, or if you want to be spicy, That Which Aches. And then most variations of the deck will include finishers like Polyhymnia and or Hippocrates Monster and Neferu's Khopesh. Cool. These are your frequently used cards in the deck. Typically, they fall into these categories. You have your ramp or stall. You have your draw, you have your removal, and then you have your threats. Ramp examples will be stuff like Fanatic of Kanoom, and then stall examples will be something like Siren of the Grave and or Demogorgon. You have your draw with cards like Vrock or Burrowing Scarab. You have your removal, which is like Apocalypse Now, Reap, Neferu, and then you have your threats like Polyhymnia. Demogorgon also counts as a threat. Also, like if you run Neferu's Kopesh and Hippocrates Monster, that's also a threat. Some cards are going to fall into two or more categories, like Half-Life and Canopic Hoarder. Half-Life and Canopic Hoarder technically fall into all categories, except for maybe threats. I think the reason why these cards are so good in the deck is they're able to kind of use your afterlife cards as like a toolbox. So like you can use Half-Life to revive a Fanatic of Renewm if you want to ramp, or if you need removal, or if you want to draw more, you can use Half-Life to revive a Vrock and Burrowing Scarab to maybe ram into another minion. So there, a lot of the cards like work very synergistically together, and overall it's just really effective to use. So I'm going to go over how to beat the deck now. There are typically three approaches. You have 1, your extremely fast win, 2, your layered threats win, and 3, your slow grind win, which is typically goes into fatigue. Each approach is going to be dependent on your deck and your opening hand. Side note as well, when I'm writing this guide, I didn't want to say like, oh, you must do A, B, C to beat this deck. I kind of wanted to leave it like more ambiguous or more open. That way players can apply these strategies according to their play style, right? Because every player has a different type of like skill expression or player expression that they'd like to do. Me personally, I love control decks, so I will prefer the slow grind win condition or the layered threats win condition sometimes over the extremely fast win, and vice versa, right? Every player has their own play style, and I really wanted to try to provide different resources for different types of players. So moving on, we're going to go into the extremely fast win condition, or the aggro win condition. I like to call this faces the place, because that's exactly what you're doing. Your win condition, this will typically be for the aggro and mid-range decks, so decks like Aggro War, Zoo Light, Aggro Magic. The goal is to defeat the board wipe death deck before they can stabilize, ideally before they unlock 7 mana. And the reason why I say ideally before 7 mana is because 7 mana is a huge power spike for the deck, because of cards like Demogorgon and Apocalypse Now. If you're an aggro deck and you're playing against the board wipe death deck, 7 mana is going to be what you're racing against. Yeah, I'm not saying you can't win after 7 mana. I'm saying that it will be a lot harder to win because the board wipe death deck will have access to those powerful stall cards, right? And all the damage that you did the previous turns could be negated by like those cards such as Demogorgon or Apocalypse Now. And the reason why this is a viable win condition too is because board wipe death decks tend to have very slow openings, and they can be exploited by aggressive decks in the early game. If the board wipe death deck does not draw their key early game cards like Siren of the Grave or Sulfuric Rain, they are going to have a very hard time surviving against aggro decks. So that's always a viable win condition. If they do get open with cards like Siren of the Grave, Ragnarok, Sulfuric Rain, it's still not impossible to win. If anything, it's just like a roadblock. But as an aggro deck, like I would like to focus on doing as much damage as possible in the early turns, with hopes of either A, establishing a strong board that they won't be able to stop by turn 7, or bursting them down before they can even try to like heal with cards like Demogorgon, and regain control of board, and so such. What? But yeah, anyways, that would be the win condition for aggro decks. Moving on to the next win condition, we're moving on to the layered threats win condition. This is going to be the win condition if you're playing for mid-range and control decks. Examples of this would be Big Beast Nature, and then Ramp Magic, or even Control War, because they have so many like big minions during the end. But basically, your goal, if you're playing this win condition, is to force the board wipe death player to use their removal inefficiently by layering your threats, right? And the reasoning behind this is there's a finite amount of removal in board wipe death. If you play your cards right, they will eventually run out of answers, right? The board wipe death deck will not have all the answers needed to deal with every situation the whole game, right? Yeah, you'll have access to cards like Apocalypse Now or Demogorgon, but if you're able to play around like those types of removals, you should be fine. And every removal can be played around against, right? Like you can play around Sulfuric Rain by summoning a minion that has more than 2 health, right? Same thing with Ragnarok. You have to summon a minion more than 3 health. With Reap, like you have to go with wide boards so that their removal is inefficient. And then with Apocalypse Now, like it's best to maybe like not overextend, right? Of course, this is easier said than done. This takes a certain amount of reading involved. And what I mean by reading is not like reading a book. Like you really have to pay attention to what cards your opponent is playing at that exact time, and then you'll have an idea of what options they have available. For example, like if the board wipe death player plays Sulfuric Rain without playing Siren of the Grave, like you'll have an idea that they don't have Siren of the Grave in their hand. Otherwise they would have just played that to ensure the board wipe. And so on and so forth. There are a whole bunch of other like examples, but it's best to really think about that. And with the layered threats idea, like basically always have a follow-up, right? So like even if you do play a board or a minion on board and they do have an answer, you want to have a follow-up to see if they have an answer to follow up the follow-up. That makes sense? And then eventually one player is not going to have the follow-up. And if your deck is a mid-range deck that can continuously put out threats, it'll be more than likely that the board wipe death player will not have a follow-up to that. So yeah, it is a little more advanced, I'd say, but if you can like apply these tactics, you should be fine. Overall, you just don't want to overextend, or you don't want to play too much of your threats at once, because the board wipe death player will be able to clear it with like cards like Apocalypse Now. Cool. Moving on, this is technically the last win condition, and this is a slow grind. This is the late game. This will typically be the win condition for control decks such as board wipe death if you're playing in the mirror match, or a control relic war. Basically the goal is to reach fatigue and outlive the board wipe death player, by eliminating their threats, like Polyhymnia or Hippocrates Monster or any other big minion that they might have. Right, so most board wipe decks will only have 2 or 3 big threats to deal with, sometimes 1 if they're just playing Polyhymnia. If you can have answers for them and end up in a favorable late game, winning through fatigue can be viable, right? And this goes by playing cards like Jason. That's a $1,500 card, but there are other substitutes like Deuteria, the Mana Shard Mage, is also a good substitute for Jason. Also, cards like That Which Aches, if you're willing to spend money but not that much money, That Which Aches is also a good card. But anyways, the ideal situation that you want to be in against, if you're playing a control deck and you're playing against board wipe death, is you want to be in a situation where you have more cards left in the deck than your opponent, right? And this can be easier said than done, but most of the time in the matchup, you're usually trying to play around Sulfuric Rain to the point where they don't make you draw more than they do, right? Because cards like Burrowing Scarab and Vrock, they'll make you draw, but they'll also make your opponent draw, so it's pretty neutral in terms of the matchup. The other thing that you do have to worry about, though, is overdraw situations, because if you get in an overdraw situation against a board wipe death deck, the board wipe death deck can make you burn really important cards in the matchup, and that can be bad, right? So you always want to make sure you manage your hand. I would say, as a safe like benchmark, have maybe 5-6 cards in your hand. Try not to have 7, 8, or 9, because it's really easy for a board wipe death player to be like, Half-Life, Burrowing Scarab, Rock, and then you end up with a full hand and you have to burn a card. So always try to like manage your resources, right? But yeah, side note, if the board wipe player is running Nefru's Kopesh and Hippocrate's Monster, achieving this win condition is a little difficult. Unless you have like relic removal and you're able to like snipe the Nefru's Kopesh before it gets into like a crazy amount of durability. The reason why it makes the win condition more difficult is because Hippocrate is a 0, or Nefru's Kopesh can revive Hippocrate at an almost like infinite amount of times. I mean, it's not really infinite. It'd probably be like maybe 4 or 5 times depending on how early they get the Kopesh. But that Hippocrate's Monster is an insanely hard monster to deal with. First of all, it's big, and also it deals with board. But just a side note. There is also one more win condition that I didn't hit on, and that's the OTK win condition. Unfortunately, OTK decks are super rare in Gods Unchained. I don't think there's any. Oh, there's one. Deck profile on that later. But if you ever run into an OTK deck, or if you ever play as an OTK deck, that deck should be favorable against board wipe death because you get a lot of time to play against them. Cool. Lastly, I'm just going to go for general tips when you play against the deck. One, you want to take note of which removal options a board wipe death player uses. This will give you an idea of what options they're holding in hand and if you can extend further. For example, when they don't play Apocalypse Now against like a pretty decent board to play against Apocalypse Now, that's usually a signal for you to overextend or extend a little more. Smart players will play greedy and try to reserve their resources for the ideal moment. So always be careful about that. But there are perfectly other examples where this is viable, such as the sulfuric rain examples that I gave earlier. That's an example where it's pretty applicable. Okay. Second tip, play around overdraw situations. Watch out for Burrowing Scarab and Sulfuric Rain shenanigans. Yeah, you don't want to overdraw. Especially if you have threats that are pretty valuable in the matchup, you don't want to burn those cards. Next, play around the removal options. Always try to make them use removal inefficiently. This kind of goes with the first tip as well. Cards with Ward, cards with Protective, and anti-sleep cards are great for this, honestly. If you want to tech in a Minotaur, or if you want to tech in like the Swart Vasilis, the anti-sleep cards are pretty good. They won't guarantee like a win in the matchup, but they are pretty helpful. And then lastly, know your win condition. Some decks are going to have multiple ways to win. For example, like Control War, you can play the layered threat way, where you just play a big minion after big minion in hopes they don't have any answers against the minions. Or it can play like the fatigue way, where they just play for like super endgame and hope they run out of cards. A lot of win conditions will have multiple ways to win, and it's up for you as the player to kind of like discern how to play your deck in that way. The biggest tell is what you open with, right? So if I'm the aggro war player and I open with like a lot of damage, I'm going to want to go face. And I'm going to want to try to get into a situation where I can just burst my opponent down before turn 7, right? Versus if I'm an aggro war player and I get like a ton of big minions but not necessarily a lot of burst damage, maybe I'll want to play the layered threats win condition and try to win that way. Overall, it's up to the player to kind of discern like how they want to win, based on the strengths of their deck, but also the strengths of their opening hand. and their draws. Win conditions can change mid-game. You just have to be able to recognize it. But yeah, overall, here are my closing thoughts. Board Wipe Death is a very strong deck, but it's not invincible. Other decks can win with like solid counterplay and a little bit of luck. I highly recommend practicing the matchup whenever possible. This might be hard to do because few players have access to the deck, especially if you're in lower ranks, because what lower ranked player will have access to Board Wipe Death unless they're like stupidly rich but also just a bad player. But if you ever run into one on ladder, don't just give up right away. Just try to apply the principles and at least try to win, because that experience is valuable versus just like, oh, I'm playing against Board Wipe Death, I guess I gotta concede, right? And then the best thing if you can't get matchup experience would be to watch any VODs of players playing the deck. I mean, I'm pretty sure like players like Fake Muse, Sambam, Copper Pitch also have like footage of them playing the deck. VODs are pretty great because you can actually just study each turn thanks to the pause button, right? So for example, like if I'm watching a VOD, like I'll pause each turn before they even make a move and then see what the optimal play would be, or try to guess what the optimal play would be, and then compare to what the actual player does, right? And then from there you can kind of like see the differences in like thinking that you have with maybe a top player or maybe a different player, or maybe you can see different lines, and that would overall just help you out as a player. But yeah, those are my closing thoughts. I just want to say, if you've made it to the end of this guide, thanks for watching. I know it was pretty beefy, but my hope is to really just like help out players that are having trouble with this matchup in particular. If you do like the content, go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel, share the content even. If you have like Twitter, that works too. I'm also on social media. Like you can also follow my Twitch, you can follow my Twitter, you can YouTube, obviously, right? I definitely want to do more content here, and if we get like more positive reception, I'll definitely keep going. But anyways, a little bit of support goes a long way, and if you can help out the channel, that'd be greatly appreciated. Anyways, that's pretty much it for me. Hope if you watched this video, hope it helped. Yeah, and if you have anything you'd like to add, maybe like more tips for the matchup, feel free to like comment below. Anyways, thanks y'all, and have a great day.